"We're restructuring the department, and your position won't be part of the new organization," said Brandon Mitchell, leaning back in his father's leather chair as if he'd occupied it for years rather than hours. His custom suit still had the tailor's chalk marks visible on the sleeve, and the Harvard Business School diploma he'd brought to display was leaning against the wall, not yet hung. I stood on the other side of the desk I'd visited hundreds of times over my 12 years at Mitchell Construction, though never before had I been spoken to with such casual dismissal. "We'll need your company vehicle and keycard before you leave. Today," Brandon continued, already looking at his phone, "HR has your paperwork ready. At 52 years old, with over 3 decades of construction management experience, I'd just been fired by a 26-year-old who had never set foot on a job site. The same young man who, during his occasional childhood visits to headquarters, I'd let play with surveying equipment and given construction hats to. The son of Tom Mitchell, who last month had suffered a stroke that prompted his sudden, temporary retirement. The same Tom who had told me just 3 weeks earlier, 'Robert, when I'm gone, this place will need your steady hand more than ever.' I nodded calmly, betraying none of the calculations already running through my mind. 'I understand,' I said, maintaining eye contact until Brandon looked away first. What he didn't understand, couldn't possibly understand from his corner office, with its walnut furniture and pristine view, was that I wasn't just the chief operations officer he was so casually discarding. I was the only person who knew about the modified structural supports on the Westlake Corporate Center, the $143 million project that had saved the company during the recession. The only person besides his father who understood the carefully negotiated handling of the contaminated soil discovered during the Franklin Street development. The only one still employed who could navigate the labyrinth of permits, inspections, and regulatory requirements for the 3 major projects currently underway. As I walked to my office to collect my personal items, I glanced at the whiteboards covered with critical project timelines and contact information that existed nowhere else. 12 years of institutional knowledge, relationships with city inspectors, and hard-won expertise, all dismissed in a 3-minute conversation by someone who thought construction management could be learned from case studies rather than concrete and steel. I didn't slam doors. I didn't make scenes. Instead, I methodically packed my personal photos and reference books while sending a single text to Tom Mitchell's personal phone. "We need to talk. Brandon, just let me go." 26 minutes later, as I handed my keycard to the uncomfortable HR representative, my phone buzzed with Tom's reply. "What? Coming in tomorrow? Do nothing until we speak." Little did Brandon know that his first executive decision would trigger a cascade of events that would fundamentally change not just the company, but his entire understanding of his place in the world. My name is Robert Harmon, and until that Tuesday morning, I'd been the Chief Operations Officer at Mitchell Construction, one of the largest commercial builders in the Pacific Northwest. I joined the company in 2010, after 20 years working my way up from carpenter to project manager at various construction firms. Tom Mitchell hired me personally during a time when the company was struggling to manage its growth. They had the contracts, but were falling behind on execution, missing deadlines, and accumulating costly penalties. I wasn't the obvious choice for a C-suite position. My education ended with an associate's degree in construction management from Portland Community College, supplemented by decades of practical experience and a handful of professional certifications. What I lacked in academic credentials, I made up for with an encyclopedic knowledge of building codes, an instinct for identifying potential problems before they materialized, and relationships throughout the industry built on consistent reliability. Tom and I formed an effective partnership almost immediately. He was the visionary and the deal maker, charismatic, connected, and ambitious. I was the implementer, detail-oriented, methodical, and unflinchingly honest about challenges. Together, we expanded Mitchell Construction from a regional player to a company handling $300+ million projects across 3 states. Our working relationship evolved into a friendship over the years. We weren't social friends who met for weekend barbecues. Tom moved in wealthier circles than I did, but we shared a deep mutual respect and understanding. He trusted my judgment on operational matters absolutely, and I appreciated his willingness to provide the resources necessary to execute projects properly rather than cutting corners for short-term profits. Brandon, Tom's only son, had always been a peripheral presence at the company. He'd appear during school breaks ostensibly to learn the business, though these educational opportunities inevitably involved more time in his father's office than on job sites. After graduating from college, he went straight to Harvard for his MBA rather than gaining practical experience. During his infrequent visits home, he would make pronouncements about industry disruption and vertical integration strategies that revealed his classroom knowledge and limited real-world understanding. Tom and I never discussed Brandon's future role explicitly, but I understood the dynamic. Mitchell was a family company, founded by Tom's father. Despite taking it public 7 years ago, the family still controlled 51% of the voting shares. Brandon would eventually join the business. That was inevitable. However, I had assumed there would be a gradual integration, a proper apprenticeship under his father's guidance. Everything changed 4 weeks ago when Tom suffered a stroke during a meeting with potential investors. The attack was serious but not fatal. Doctors predicted a full recovery with proper rehabilitation, but the timeline was months, not weeks. The board appointed CFO Patricia Yamamoto as interim CEO, with the understanding that major decisions would be delayed until Tom's return. Then Brandon arrived. Having just completed his MBA, he leveraged his family's controlling interest to convince several board members that he should step in as executive chairman while his father recovered. The position was largely ceremonial in most companies, but Brandon immediately began asserting authority over operational decisions. Patricia, not wanting a public power struggle that might destabilize the company further, accommodated his involvement while trying to maintain day-to-day stability. I had concerns, but kept them professional, focusing on ensuring our current projects remained on track despite the leadership uncertainty. When Brandon called me to his father's office, now his office, I'd assumed we would be discussing the Westlake inspection scheduled for the following week, a critical milestone for our largest active project. Instead, I was fired in less time than it takes to pour a cup of coffee. As I drove home in my personal vehicle, having surrendered the company car to a waiting facilities manager, I carefully considered my options. My initial anger had already given way to analytical thinking, a trait that had served me well throughout my career. Brandon's decision wasn't just personally insulting, it was operationally reckless. The question was how to respond in a way that would protect both my interests and the company Tom had built. My first call was to Patricia Yamamoto. We'd worked together for 8 years and maintained a relationship of professional respect, though we operated in different spheres of the business. "Robert, I just heard," she said, answering immediately. "This wasn't discussed with me beforehand. I'm trying to understand what happened." Brandon mentioned restructuring. "Is that actually happening, or was it just justification?" Patricia sighed audibly. "There's been no approved restructuring plan. Brandon scheduled a strategy meeting for next week, but nothing has been decided. This appears to be independent action." We spoke for another 10 minutes. Patricia couldn't reverse Brandon's decision, not without triggering a governance crisis that might further destabilize the company. But she provided valuable context. Brandon had brought in 2 former classmates as strategic consultants and had been meeting with them privately for several days. Word among the executive team was that he planned a significant reorganization to make his mark while his father was absent. My next call was to Tom's wife, Margaret. We'd known each other as long as I'd known Tom, and she answered with concern in her voice. "Robert, Tom's very upset about this. His blood pressure spiked when he got your text, and the doctors are monitoring him closely. He tried calling Brandon, but there's been no answer." "How is he otherwise?" I asked, genuinely concerned about my friend's health. "Improving daily, but frustrated by the restrictions. The doctors say he needs at least 6 more weeks of rehabilitation before considering even part-time work. Please tell him not to worry about me, I'll be fine. His recovery is what matters right now." After hanging up, I spent the rest of the day taking inventory of my situation. Financially, I was stable, My salary at Mitchell had been generous, I had minimal debt, and my reputation in the industry would make finding another position relatively straightforward. Although relocating might be necessary given Mitchell's dominance in the local market, the more pressing concern was the immediate impact of my departure on current projects. The Westlake inspection troubled me particularly. The modifications we'd made to the structural supports, approved by engineers and perfectly safe, but requiring specific explanation to inspectors, could create serious complications if not properly managed. There were also specialized suppliers I'd cultivated relationships with over years, who provided crucial materials for our current projects, arrangements not formally documented in our systems. That evening, my phone rang continuously as news of my departure spread through the company. Project managers, site supervisors, even several subcontractors called seeking clarification or expressing concern. I provided reassurance without undermining Brandon's authority. Whatever my personal feelings, I wouldn't sabotage Tom's company out of spite. The most interesting call came at 9:17 p.m. from Daniel Parker, the lead inspector for the city building department who was scheduled to review the Westlake project. "Robert, I just heard you're no longer with Mitchell. We still on for next Tuesday's inspection?" "I won't be there, Dan. Someone else from Mitchell will handle it." A pause. "The thing is, we had that understanding about the modified central supports. The documentation submitted doesn't fully reflect the adjustments we discussed, without you there to walk through it." I closed my eyes, seeing the problem immediately. The modified supports were fully compliant with code, but represented an innovative approach that had saved millions in materials and months in construction time. The paperwork reflected the end result, but not the specialized implementation process I had personally overseen. "You'll need to speak with whoever Mitchell sends," I said carefully. "I'm no longer authorized to represent the company." "Right." Another pause. This could get complicated. After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, creating a comprehensive list of similar situations across our active projects, specialized knowledge or relationships that resided with me rather than in company documentation. By midnight, I had identified 17 critical issues that could potentially delay projects, complicate inspections, or disrupt supply chains, each individually manageable, but collectively representing millions of dollars in potential costs and delays. I didn't sleep well that night, torn between loyalty to Tom and the company I'd helped build, and the reality that Brandon had summarily dismissed me without even basic professional courtesy. By morning, I had decided on a path forward that I could live with ethically. I would document everything clearly, make myself available to Tom, but not Brandon, for transition questions, and otherwise step away cleanly. This wasn't about revenge. It was about professional integrity. At 8:30 a.m., Tom called from his rehabilitation facility. "Robert, this is completely unauthorized," he said, his speech slightly slowed from the stroke, but his mind clearly sharp. "Brandon had no authority to make executive changes without board approval. It's done now, Tom. The important thing is making sure the projects don't suffer. I've called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow. Patricia will represent me. This will be fixed." I took a deep breath. Tom, with respect, reversing the decision now would create more disruption. What the company needs is a clean knowledge transfer to whoever is taking over my responsibilities. The silence on the line told me Tom understood the underlying message. Bringing me back would mean publicly undermining his son. Something that would damage both Brandon's authority and the company's stability. As much as he might want to reverse the decision, the better path was ensuring a smooth transition. "What do you need?" he finally asked. "Time with your project leads to transfer critical information, and Brandon needs to understand what he doesn't." "No," Tom sighed audibly. "I'll make it happen." That afternoon I received a stiffly formal email from Brandon, requesting my presence at a transition meeting the following morning. The language suggested Patricia's hand in composing it, though Brandon's signature appeared at the bottom. I arrived at Mitchell Construction at exactly 9 a.m., signing in as a visitor at the security desk, where I had nodded good morning for 12 years. The receptionist couldn't quite meet my eyes as she handed me the visitor badge. Brandon kept me waiting in the conference room for 17 minutes. a transparent power play that would have been more effective if I hadn't noticed. Him pacing nervously in the hallway through the glass walls for the last 10 of those minutes. When he finally entered, he was accompanied by Patricia and Jennifer Liu, our legal counsel. Brandon's expression was a carefully managed mask of professional detachment, though the slight redness around his collar betrayed his discomfort. "Thank you. You for coming in, Robert," he began, the formality awkward between us. "We appreciate your willingness to assist with transition matters." I nodded, saying nothing, waiting. "I understand there are some unique aspects of current projects that may require clarification," he continued. 17 critical issues across our active projects, I confirmed, placing a folder on the table, each requiring specific knowledge not fully documented in our systems. Jennifer opened the folder and began reviewing my detailed notes. Her eyebrows rose slightly as she processed the implications. Patricia, who understood our operations better, looked increasingly concerned as she read over Jennifer's shoulder. "This seems very comprehensive," Brandon said, attempting to maintain his executive demeanor despite clearly not understanding the technical details. "We should be able to manage these items with our current team. You don't have anyone on staff who can explain the structural modifications to the Westlake Central supports to Daniel Parker," I replied calmly. "The inspection is Tuesday. If it fails, you'll face at minimum a 3-week delay, approximately $420,000 in idle labor and equipment costs, and potential contract penalties of $50,000 per day." The conference room fell silent. Patricia looked at Brandon, who was processing the financial implications. "What do you propose?" Patricia asked, taking control of the conversation. "I'll prepare detailed briefing documents for each issue and make myself available for consultation at my standard industry rate of $275 per hour, with a minimum engagement of 20 hours. Brandon's jaw tightened at the consultation fee, substantially higher than my previous hourly compensation, but Patricia nodded immediately. "That seems reasonable given the circumstances," she said, before Brandon could object. "We'll need you to start immediately with the Westlake situation." For the next 2 weeks, I worked as a consultant for Mitchell Construction, methodically transferring knowledge to project teams while carefully documenting everything. Brandon avoided direct interaction with me, communicating through Patricia when necessary. I maintained professional detachment throughout, focusing on protecting the projects rather than personal vindication. The Westlake inspection passed, though, only after I spent 4 hours briefing the project manager on exactly what to show Daniel Parker and how to explain the modifications. Similar scenarios played out across other projects, not sabotage through withholding information, but the inevitable friction when specialized knowledge transfers hands abruptly. 3 weeks after my firing, the true consequences of Brandon's impulsive decision began to emerge. Without my daily oversight, small issues that would have been addressed immediately began accumulating. A specialty concrete pour on the Franklin Street project was delayed because the new operations team didn't understand our agreement with the supplier. Permit renewals that I had tracked through personal relationships with city officials fell through administrative cracks. Most significantly, Brandon's restructuring moved forward with his Harvard classmates now installed as highly paid consultants. They implemented textbook management approaches that looked impressive in slideshows, but failed to account for the practical realities of construction projects. The quarterly financial results revealed the impact. Project delays had triggered penalty clauses, consultant fees had ballooned operational costs, and several key team members had left for competitors, concerned about the company's new direction. Mitchell Construction reported its first quarterly loss in 7 years. The morning after the financial announcement, I received a call from Patricia. "The board has called a special meeting," she said without preamble. "Tom will be attending via video conference. They've asked if you would be available as well." "In what capacity?" I asked. "That's what they'll be discussing." "Robert, things aren't going well here." The board meeting was scheduled for the following day. I prepared carefully, reviewing project statuses through my industry contacts and compiling notes on what would be required to get each back on track. This wasn't about gloating over Brandon's failures, but about potentially helping save a company I still cared about deeply. The boardroom felt different as a visitor rather than an executive. Tom appeared on a large screen at the head of the table, looking thinner but alert and engaged. Brandon sat to one side, his expression tense. Several board members nodded to me respectfully as I took my seat. Board Chair Eleanor Richardson opened the meeting directly. We're facing a crisis of leadership and execution. The numbers speak for themselves. Tom has a proposal he'd like to present. Tom looked at me through the video feed. Robert, I'd like you to return as Chief Operations Officer, with expanded authority over all project execution. Brandon will continue as Executive Chairman, but will focus on client relationships and business development, areas better suited to his skills and experience. I glanced at Brandon, whose face had flushed deep red. This wasn't just a reversal of his decision, it was a public acknowledgement of his limitations. Before I respond, I said carefully, I'd like to understand Brandon's perspective on this arrangement. The room fell silent. Brandon looked startled at being directly addressed. Clearly he had expected either immediate acceptance on my part or continued conflict. I've learned some valuable lessons, he said after a moment, the words clearly difficult. The company is more complex than I understood. My father believes this structure would be beneficial, and I respect his judgment. It wasn't a full acknowledgement of error, but it represented more self-awareness than I had expected. I nodded slightly in recognition of what that admission must have cost him. I'll return under 2 conditions, I said, addressing the full board. First, complete operational authority for all active projects, reporting directly to the board, until Tom returns. Second, a formal executive development program for Brandon, including rotations through each operational department, starting with site supervision. Tom smiled slightly on the screen. He understood immediately what I was offering his son. Not humiliation, but education. Brandon looked less certain but nodded his agreement. Those terms are acceptable, Eleanor confirmed after a quick glance around the table. My return to Mitchell Construction the following Monday created an immediate sense of relief among the project teams. The practical problems that had accumulated were addressable, though several would require intensive intervention to avoid significant financial impact. I worked 14-hour days for the first 2 weeks, personally visiting each active site and rebuilding fractured relationships with suppliers and regulatory officials. Brandon, to his credit, approached his education with unexpected humility. I assigned him to shadow our most experienced site supervisor, a gruff veteran named Frank, who had no patience for academic theories but infinite knowledge about the practical realities of construction. Brandon showed up in proper work boots and a hard hat, asking questions and genuinely listening to the answers. 3 months later, Mitchell Construction had returned to profitability, though not yet at previous levels. The restructuring consultants were gone, their contracts paid out but not renewed. Most importantly, Tom had returned to limited duties, looking markedly healthier and fully engaged with strategic decisions while leaving day-to-day operations. To me, on a Friday afternoon, Brandon knocked on my office door, the same office I had been ordered to vacate on his first day. "Do you have a minute?" he asked, the arrogance of those early days entirely absent. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "What's on your mind?" "I owe you an apology," he said simply. "Not just for firing you, but for not understanding what you actually do here. What you contribute." I studied him for a moment, seeing elements of Tom in his features, but also something distinctly his own. Perhaps the beginning of wisdom that comes only through failure and recovery. "The company means something different to each of us," I replied. "For me, it's been a professional home for 12 years. For you, it's a family legacy. Both perspectives have value." He nodded slowly. "Dad always said you were the most diplomatic." Straight shooter he'd ever met. A small smile. I think I understand what he meant now. Our working relationship evolved gradually after that conversation. Brandon completed rotations through each department, genuinely learning the business, from the ground up rather than the top down. When he eventually moved into a vice president role focusing on business development, 14 months after his disastrous first day as executive chairman, the promotion was earned rather than inherited. I stayed with Mitchell Construction, for another 5 years, eventually transitioning to a board position when I decided to reduce my workload. The company thrived under a leadership team that balanced Tom's vision, Brandon's gradually developing business acumen, and the practical expertise I had helped instill throughout the organization. Got fired by my boss's son on his first day, and he had no idea that it would make his world collapse, not in the catastrophic way he might have feared during those difficult early weeks, but in the constructive sense of dismantling false assumptions and rebuilding with a foundation of genuine understanding. Sometimes collapse is necessary before something stronger can be constructed, in buildings and in character alike. The experience reinforced what 30 years in construction had already taught me, that the strongest structures are those built with proper foundations, that shortcuts invariably lead to costly repairs, and that the most valuable education comes from the projects that don't go as planned. Brandon learned these lessons earlier than his father had hoped, but perhaps exactly when he needed to, young enough to rebuild with the right guidance into the leader he had prematurely assumed he already was.